Welcome. Today we're at part 12 of The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood. Starting from page 110. This is no doubt a somewhat weak defense of Fichte. It comes to saying that if he made a silly mistake about history, he was only following a silly mistake of a more general kind made by Kant. But if anyone who calls these notions silly mistakes is claiming to understand better than Kant or Fichte the relation between logical sequence and temporal sequence. Ever since Plato in the Timaeus said that time is the moving image of eternity, philosophers have for the most part agreed that there was some relation between these two things, and that the necessary sequence by which one event leads to another in time was in some way identical in character with the necessary sequence by which one thing leads to another in a non-temporal logical series. If this is denied, and it is maintained that temporal sequence and logical implication have nothing to do with each other, historical knowledge becomes impossible, for it follows that we can never say about any event, "This must have happened." The past can never appear as the conclusion of a logical inference. If the temporal series is a mere aggregate of the disconnected events, we can never argue back from the present to the past. But historical thinking consists precisely of arguing back in this way, and it is therefore based on the assumption, or as Kant and Fichte would have said it, on the a priori principle, that there is an internal or necessary connection between the events of a time series, such as the one that one event leads necessarily to another, and we can argue back from the second to the first. On this principle, there is only one way in which the present state of things can ever come into existence, and history is the analysis of the present in order to see what this process must have been. I am not defending in the particular way in which Fichte reconstructs the past history of his own age. I think it is very faulty, and its faults, so far as they are faults of principle, were due to following Kant in separating too sharply the a priori elements in knowledge from the empirical. This made him think that history can be reconstructed purely on a priori basis, without reliance on empirical evidence of documents. But insofar as he insisted that all historical knowledge contains a priori concepts and principles, he was right. He understood the nature of history better than the people who ridicule him because they think that history is purely empirical. In one way, Fichte's philosophy of history makes an important advance on Kant's. In Kant, there are two conceptions presupposed by history itself. One, a plan of nature, conceived as something formed in advance of its own execution. Two, human nature, with its passion, conceived as the matter in which this form is to be carried out. History itself is the result of imposing this pre-existing form on this pre-existing matter. Thus, the historical process is not conceived as really creative. It is merely a putting together of two abstractions, and there is no attempt to show why they should ever come together, or indeed why either, let alone both, should exist. In Kant's theory, in fact, rests on a number of disconnected assumptions, none of which it attempts to justify. Fichte's theory is logically much simpler and much less exposed to the charge of multiplying entities unnecessarily. The only thing which it presupposes as required before history begins is the concept itself, with its own proper logical structure and the dynamic relation between the elements in that structure. The driving force in history is just this dynamic movement of the concept. So that instead of two things, a plan and a driving force, in Fichte there is only one, the plan being a dynamic plan, the logical structure of the concept, which supplies its own motive force. The fruits of this Fichtean discovery ripened in Hegel. Subsection 6, Schelling. Schelling was Hegel's junior, and it may be open to dispute whether The doctrines which Hegel shared with Schelling were reached by independent thinking or under Schelling's influence. But since Schelling published a system of philosophy, perhaps more than one, including his views on history long before Hegel wrote the first sketch of philosophy of history in the Heidelberg Encyclopedia. I don't know why I had trouble with that. It will be convenient to say something of Schelling's views first. Schelling gave a more systematic development to the ideas of Kant and Fichte. His thought turned on two principles. First, the idea that whatever exists is knowable, i.e., an embodiment or rationality, or, in his own language, a manifestation of the absolute. Secondly, the idea of a relation between two terms, which, though opposites, are both in this way embodiments of the absolute. The absolute itself being an identity in which their differences disappear. This two-term pattern reappears all throughout his philosophy. There are, according to Schelling, two great realms of the knowable, nature and history. Each is intelligible, is a manifestation of the absolute, but they embody it in opposite ways. Nature consists of things distributed in space, whose intelligibility consists merely in a way in which they are distributed, or in the regular and determinate relation between them. History consists of thoughts and actions of minds, which are not only intelligible, but intelligent to themselves, not merely something other than themselves. Hence, they are a more adequate embodiment of the absolute because they contain in themselves both sides of the knowledge relation. They are subject as well as object. As objectively intelligible, the activity of the mind in history is necessary. As subjective intelligent, it is free. The course of historical development, is thus the complete genesis of mind's self-awareness as at once free and under law, that is, morally and politically autonomous. Here, Schelling follows Kant. The stages through which this development passes are determined by the logical structure of the concept itself. Here he follows Fichte. It is therefore in its largest features divisible into two. First, a phase where man conceives the absolute as nature, where reality is conceived as broken up and dispersed into separate realities, polytheism, where political forms come into existence and perish like natural organisms, leaving nothing behind them. And secondly, a phase where the absolute is conceived as history, that is, as a continuous development where man freely works out the purposes of the absolute, cooperating with the providence in its plan for the development of human rationality. In this modern age, where human life is controlled by scientific, historical, and philosophical thought. The most important of the conceptions which Schelling here is trying to work out is the conception that in history, the absolute itself is coming into full and complete existence. Even Fichte thought that the logical structure of the concept was complete before history began and served as a presupposition of the process. In Schelling, the dynamic structure of the absolute is not the ground of the dynamic element in history. It is the element itself. The material universe has always been intelligible insofar as it has always been a manifestation of the absolute. But the absolute cannot be identical with the barely intelligible, for the mere intelligibility is a mere potentiality, which must be actualized by becoming actually understood. Nature, qua intelligible, demands a knower to understand it, and exhibits its full essence only when there is a mind to know it. Then, for the first time, there is an actual power and an actual actual knower and an actual known. And rationality, which is the absolute, has advanced to a higher and more complete manifestation of itself. But there now arises a new kind of intelligibility. Mind itself is not only a knower, but a knowable, and consequently, the absolute cannot be satisfied with a situation in which the mind knows nature. Therefore, or there must be a further stage in which the mind knows itself. As the process of self-knowledge advances, new stages in self-knowledge enrich the knowing mind and thus create things for it to know. History is a temporal process in which both knowledge and the knowable are progressively coming into existence, and this is expressed by calling history the self-realization of the absolute, where the absolute means both reason as the knowable and reason as the knower. Subsection 7. Hegel. The accumulation of the historical movement to which began in 1784 with Herder came with Hegel, whose lectures on the philosophy of history were first delivered in 1822 to 23. Anyone who reads his philosophy of history by itself cannot think it is a profoundly original and revolutionary work, wherein history for the first time steps out full grown on the stage of philosophical thought. But when consideration is given to the work of his predecessors, his book becomes far less startling and far less original. He proposes a new kind of history, to be called the philosophy of history, the proposal and the terminology being as old as Voltaire. But the philosophy of history is for him not a philosophical reflection on history, but history itself raised to a higher power and become philosophical as distinct from merely empirical. That is, history not merely ascertained, but as so much fact, but understood by apprehending the reasons why the facts happened as they did. This philosophical history will be a universal history of mankind, where Hegel follows Herder, and will exhibit a progress from primitive times to the civilization of today. The plot of this story is the development of freedom, which is identical with the immoral reason of man as exhibited in the external systems of social relations. So that the question which philosophical history has to answer is the question how the state came into existence. All this is taken from Kant. But the historian knows nothing of the future. History accumulates not in a future utopia, but in the actual present. This is Schiller. Man's freedom is the same thing as his consciousness of his freedom. So is the development of freedom is a development of consciousness, a process of thought or logical development, in which the various necessary phases or moments of the concept are successively achieved. This is Fichte. Lastly, philosophical history exhibits no mere human process, but is a cosmic process, a process in which the world comes into realizing itself in the self-consciousness as spirit. This is Schelling. Thus, every one of the characteristics of Hegel's philosophy of history is drawn by him from his predecessors, but he has combined their views with an extraordinary skill into a theory so coherent and so unified that it deserves independent consideration as a whole. And I propose, therefore, to draw attention to some of his distinctive features. First, Hegel refuses to approach history by the way of nature. He insists that nature and history are different things. Each is a process and congeries of processes, but these processes of nature are not historical. Nature has no history. The processes of nature are cyclical. Nature goes round and round. Nothing is constructed or built up by the repetition of such revolutions. Each sunrise, each spring, each tide is like the last. The law governing the cycle does not change as the cycle repeats itself. Nature is a system of higher and lower organisms. The higher depending on the lower, logically, and the higher organisms are posterior to the lower, but not temporally. Hegel flatly denies the evolutionary theory which makes the higher develop in time out of the lower, asserting that people who believe this are mistaking a logical succession for a temporal one. History, on the contrary, never repeats itself. Its movements travel in circles, not in circles, but in spirals. The apparent repetitions are always differentiated by having acquired something new. Thus, wars reappear from time to time in history, but every new war is in some way a new kind of war, owing to the lessons learnt by the human beings in the last one. Hegel must be given credit for having stated an important distinction, but he has stated it wrongly. He is right to distinguish the non-historical process of nature from the historical process of human life, but wrong to reinforce this distinction by denying the doctrine of evolution. Since Darwin, we have found ourselves obliged to accept that doctrine and to conceive the process of nature as resembling the process of history in a way in which Hegel thought it did not resemble it, namely by producing increments of itself as it goes on. But it remains true of that process of nature is different from the process of history. That, for example, the succession of geological periods is not a truly historical succession, but it is a peculiar to history that the historian reenacts in his own mind the thoughts and motives of the agents whose actions he is narrating. And in no succession of events is an historical process unless it consists of acts whose motives can, in principle at least, thus be reenacted. Geology presents us with a series of events, but history is not history unless it presents us with a series of acts. Thus, Hegel's conclusion is right. There is no history except the history of human life, and that, not merely as life, but as rational life, the life of thinking beings. Secondly, and following immediately from this, all history is the history of thought. Insofar as human actions are mere events, the historian cannot understand them. Strictly, he cannot even ascertain that they have happened. They are only knowable to him as the outward expression of thoughts. For example, to reconstruct the history of a political struggle like that between the Roman emperors of the first century and the senatorial opposition, what the historian has to do is see how the two parties conceived the political situation as it stood, and how they proposed to develop that situation. He must grasp their political ideas, both concerning their actual present and concerning their possible future. Here again, Hegel was certainly right. It is not knowing what people did, but understanding what they thought that is proper definition for the historian's task. Thirdly, the force which is the mainspring of the historical process, to use Kant's phrase, is reason. This is a very important and difficult doctrine. What Hegel means by it is that everything which happens in history happens by the will of man. For the historical process consists of human actions, and the will of man is nothing but man's thought expressing itself outwardly in action. If it is said that human thought is often or generally far from reasonable, Hegel will reply that this is an error which comes of failing to apprehend the historical situation in which a given piece of thinking is done. Thinking is never done in a vacuum. It is always done by a determinate person in a determinate situation. I'm going to pause right here. I've talked about this before. You cannot take the subject out of the context. It is done by a determinate person, specific person, in a specific situation. And every historical character in every historical situation thinks and acts as rationally as that person in that situation can think and act, and nobody can do more. This is a very fertile and valuable principle, which Hegel worked out with very important consequences. He held that the abstractly rational man, conceived by the Enlightenment, is nothing real. The reality is a man who is both rational and passionate, never purely one or the other, his passions being one of a rational being and his thoughts of those of a passionate being. And further, without passion, there is no reason and no action. To prove, therefore, that someone acted in a certain way from passion, e.g., a judge sentencing a criminal in a fit of anger, or a statesman overriding the opposition for motives of ambition, is not to prove that he did not act rationally, for the judge's sentence or the statesman's policies may be a just or wise one, notwithstanding his passionate element in its execution. Hence, Hegel maintains the admitted fact that human history exhibits itself as a display of passions does not prove that it is not controlled by reason. He thinks of passion as the stuff, so to speak, out of which history is made. It is, from one point of view, a display of passions and nothing else. But all the same, it is a display of reason. For reason uses passion itself as a tool in bringing about its ends. This conception of the cunning of reason, the conception of reason as tricking the passions into the position of its agents, is a famously difficulty of Hegel's theory. He seems to personify reason into something outside human life, which brings about, through the agency of blind and passionate men, purposes which are its purposes and not theirs. Sometimes Hegel perhaps falls into the view like the theological view of the Middle Ages, where the plans that are executed in history are the plans of God and in no sense the plans of men. Or, if it is possible to distinguish the two, the crypto-theological view of the Enlightenment historians like and Kant were the plans that are executed in history are the plans not of man, but of nature. On the whole, however, it is clear that Hegel wanted to do was to get away from this view. The reason those plans are executed in history is, for Hegel, neither an abstract natural reason nor a transcendent divine reason, but a human reason, the reason of finite persons. And the relation which he asserts between reason and passion is not a relation between God and nature, as rational, man as passionate, but a relation between human reason and human passion. This must be remembered when it is said that Hegel's view of history is a rationalistic view. His rationalism is of a very curious kind because it conceives of irrational elements as the essential to reason itself. This conception of the intimate relation between reason and unreason in human life and in the mind as such really heralds a new conception of man, a dynamic instead of a static concept. It signifies that Hegel is working away from the abstract and static theory of human nature which prevailed in the 18th century. Fourthly, since all history is the history of thought and exhibits the self-development of reason, the historical process is at bottom a logical process. Historical transitions are, so to speak, logical transitions set out on a time scale. History is nothing but a kind of logic where the relation of logical priority and posteriority is not so much replaced as enriched or consolidated by becoming a relation of temporal priority and posteriority. Hence, the developments that take place in history are never accidental. They are necessary. And our knowledge of an historical process is not merely empirical, it is a priori, and we can see the necessity of it. Nothing in Hegel's philosophy has aroused more protest and hostility than the idea of history as a logical process developed in time and of our knowledge of it as a priori. But I have already argued in connection with Fichte that this idea is not so absurd as at first sight it may seem. And indeed, of the objections to it are mere misunderstandings. Fichte's error, as I pointed out in subsection 5, was to think that history could be reconstructed on a purely a priori basis without reliance on empirical evidence. Hegel's critics, on the other hand, commonly fall into the opposite area of believing that historical knowledge is purely empirical, and that this knowledge is an error. I also argued in subsection 5. Hegel himself avoided both those errors. Like Kant, he distinguished a pure a priori knowledge from knowledge containing a priori elements, and he regarded history not as an instance of the not of the former, but of the latter. History in his view, consisted of empirical events which were the outward expression of thought, and the thoughts behind the events, not the events themselves, formed a chain of logically connected concepts. When you only look at the events and not the thoughts behind them, you may see no necessary connection at all. And the people who blame Hegel for thinking that they are necessary connections in history are looking at history empirically as mere outward facts, and assure us quite rightly that when they look at it in that way, they see no logical connection. Quite right, Hegel would have answered. Between mere events, there are none. But history consists of actions, and actions have an inside and an outside. On the outside, they are mere events related in space and time, but not otherwise. On the outside, they are thoughts, bound to each other by a logical connection. What Hegel is doing is to insist that the historian must first work empirically by studying the documents and other evidence. It is only in this way that he can establish what the facts are. But he must then look at the facts from the inside and tell us that what they look like from that point of view. It is no reply to him to say that they look different from the outside. This retort, I think, applies to the most serious and systematic of all Hegel's critics, namely Croce. He maintains that Hegel's whole philosophy of history is a gigantic blunder, produced by confusing two quite different things, namely opposition and distinction. Concepts, Croce says, are related by opposition, good and bad, true and false, freedom and necessity, and so forth. And the theory of their relation, he admits, has well been expounded by Hegel in his theory of dialectic, in which he describes the way in which any concept stands in a necessary relation to its own opposite, generating at first and then negating it. So that way in which the concept sorry, my eyes are hurting at this point. So that the way in which the concepts lives is by creating and overcoming oppositions. But the individual things, which are the instances of concepts, are never related to each other by the way of opposition, only by the way of distinction. Consequently, the relations between them are not dialectical. And in history, which is the history of individual actions and the persons of civilizations, there is no consequential dialectic. Whereas Hegel's whole philosophy of history turns on the principle that every historical process is a dialectical process in which one form of life, for example Greece, generates its own opposites, in this case Rome. And out of this thesis and antithesis, there rises a synthesis, in this case the Christian world. Plausible though Croce's view is, it does not really get to the heart of the problem. It implies that in talking of history, we should never use the words like opposition or antagonism, and synthesis or reconciliation. We ought not, for example, to say that despotism and liberalism are opposite political doctrines. We ought only to say that they are different. We ought not to speak of opposition, but only of a difference between Whigs and Tories, or Catholics and Protestants. Now it is true that we do not need to use terms like opposition, let me call them dialectical terms, when we are talking only of the outward events of history. When we are talking about the inward thoughts which underlie those events, it seems to me that we cannot avoid them. For example, we can describe the mere outward events of the colonization of New England without using any dialectical language. But when we try to see these events as deliberate attempts on the part of the Pilgrim Fathers to carry out in terms of a practice of a Protestant idea of life, we are talking about the thoughts, and we must describe them in dialectical terms. We must, for example, speak of the opposition between the congregational idea of religious institutions and the episcopal one, and admit of the relation between the idea of the priesthood based on apostolic succession and the idea of one not so based is a dialectical relation. From this point of view, Greek civilization is the realizing of the Greek idea of life. That is the Greek conception of man. That is the Greek conception of man. Sorry. Roman civilization is the realization of Roman concepts of man. And between these two concepts, the relation, on Croce's own showing, is a dialectical relation. But all this but this is all that Hegel ever maintained. On a fifth point, and to another on which Hegel has been bitterly criticized, is his doctrine that history ends not in the future but in the present. For example, the very able and sympathetic Swiss writer Edward Futer says that a philosophy of history which traces the course of human life from its beginning to the end of the world and the last judgment, as medieval thinkers did, is a respectable and dignified thing to do. But Hegel's philosophy of history, which makes history end not with the last judgment but with the present day, only ends in glorifying and idealizing the present, denying any further progress is possible, and providing a pseudo-philosophical justification for a policy of rigid and unintelligent conservatism. That was 10 pages up to page 120 of the idea of history by R.G. Collingwood. I'll now pop out the chat and talk. If you're listening to the audiobook, just skip to the next week's video. It's not next week already. I'm sorry. Yeah, I like live streaming my hobbies and stuff because it makes it the people that don't care about my hobbies are just gonna scroll past. The people that actually do the same hobbies as me or are into the same stuff will stay, and those are the people that I'm trying to reach. I'm trying to reach my tribe, you could say. People that care about philosophy, that like music and like learning and like art. Those are the people that I'm trying to reach. Because I just I like hanging out with y'all. It's fun. But yeah, I'm probably since there's only like 3 viewers here, I'm just gonna cut this one off and then go straight into the DJ Philosophia live stream because I want things to kind of stay separate. I don't want the book to be filled with music stuff, vice versa. So I'll catch y'all in just a sec. I'm gonna get reset up.